to a review of biochemistry. So this is just to review material that you covered back in first year, and it's to help you get up to scratch with your biochemistry before we progress in this case. So to start with, you may remember this figure, and it has all the pathways very generalized, but what we covered in first year. So in green, down the center here, you'll see the carbohydrate pathways. So we have glycolysis going down from glucose, gluconeogenesis going back the other way, storage into glycogen. From pyruvate, which is the end of glycolysis, you'll go down through acetyl-CoA into the citric acid or the Krebs cycle, and energy is then produced from the electron transport chain. In the purple here, we have fatty acid metabolism going up as storage into fats and then back down, metabolizing fatty acids for use as energy. And when you use fatty acids for energy, in most cases, you're using them as ketone bodies. And on the left here, we have protein metabolism. So you consume proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids, and each different amino acid can enter into this biochemical pathway at different points, and we'll just review each of these briefly. So if we start with carbohydrates, this is the primary fuel for the body, particularly the brain. So the brain requires glucose for its metabolism. From a gram of carbohydrate, you get about 4 kilocalories per gram of energy. And on this slide, you'll see just a picture of glucose, what the structure is. So we break this down via glycolysis. So this is the next slide. Glucose is broken down via glycolysis into pyruvate. Pyruvate can then be further broken down and enter the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, and the byproducts of that are carbon dioxide, water, and obviously ATP, energy. If you need fast energy, then it will proceed into the Cori cycle, so it just gets recycled where it produces lactate, and that's our carbohydrate metabolism. As I said, it's a major fuel for the brain. Protein is the next one I want to revise. So proteins are made up of amino acids. As with carbohydrates, they have 4 kilocalories per gram, but in normal speak we'd say that's 4 calories. And proteins are a source of essential amino acids, and we synthesize many proteins in our body. So we have genes code for proteins. You need amino acids to build your internal proteins, and you can get those from digesting proteins, breaking down into individual amino acids, and then rebuilding your own. Animals can't synthesize their own amine group, so you do need proteins in your diet. Now there's different structural levels. You don't need to worry about revising those there, but remember, proteins are not just linear molecules. They're conglomerates and balls and chains all mixed up together. So amino acid metabolism. So once you proteins will get broken down into individual amino acids. The carbon skeleton of about 20 amino acids are converted into one of only 7 molecules, and the 7 molecules are listed here. Now these can be further grouped. Those that will go on to be ketogenic. So keto is talking about your ketones. So these are these carbon skeletons are converted into acetyl-CoA or acetoacetyl-CoA, which will then go on to ketogenesis to make ketone bodies and acetoacetate. The other 5 listed here are gluconeogenic, so these will go into more of the carbohydrate metabolism pathway, so glycolysis. So I've just listed further which amino acids go where. So there's certain amino acids will be ketogenic, others can be ketogenic or glucogenic depending on what they're broken down to, and the remaining 14 will definitely be glucogenic. So we can derive energy from amino acids, but you should also remember that we do not store protein in our body. We have protein in our muscles. They're there for structure and for function, but we do not store proteins as fuel. We do, however, store carbohydrates, and as you'd be well aware, we definitely store fat. So, and that moves me on to fats. Fats are the most concentrated form of energy in the body. So per gram of fat, you get 9 kilocalories. So, and we call that 9 calories. There's different types of fats, so fatty acids, triacylglycerol, phospholipids, and sterols. And the triacylglycerol, which I'll go on to talk about, have this general structure of a glycerol with three tails attached. So fat metabolism, now I'm just going to brief over this, but if you need further revision, go back to fatty acid metabolism lecture in year 1. But we ingest fats, we then break them down, and there's different steps they go through to their final destination, which is often storage in adipocytes, ready to be there when we need access to the fats to be used for fuel. So we ingest fats, we degrade them, we take them up into our intestine, we form these things called chylomicrons. These move through our lymphatic and bloodstream. We then release the fatty acids and glycerol. They enter the cells, and once they're in cells, they're either oxidized for fuel or reesterified, so put back together for storage. Now, if you don't have a high fatty diet, you won't have a lot of fat storage. If you eat a lot of fat, then your body doesn't need it for energy. You will be storing it a lot. So that's what happens under normal circumstances. We eat carbs, fats, and proteins. The first pass, you'd use up your carbohydrates. You'd then switch to fatty acid metabolism. You're breaking down the proteins into amino acids for use, but rarely would you need to use those as fuel for energy until you start starving. So if you have low blood sugar, so after one day of not eating, you're going to start decreasing how much insulin you're producing. So remember, insulin is produced when your blood sugar is high, you're well fed, you don't need to use up stored energy because you've got plenty of energy that you've just consumed, so you are actually storing energy you've just eaten. But after a day of not eating, you'll stop producing that insulin, you'll start secreting glucagon, which is starting to tell the body, oh, let's switch now, we need to access those stored fuels because I'm hungry. The body needs fuel. You'll start mobilizing the stored fats, the triacylglycerols. They're in your adipose tissues. And the liver will also start producing glucose, and it does this by gluconeogenesis. So precursors that can go into the gluconeogenesis pathway will start producing glucose. The glucose can then be transported to the tissue that requires glucose to go through glycolysis in the Krebs cycle to produce energy. So remember, the liver is a major site for these things to happen. The liver will also obtain energy by oxidizing fatty acids, which are released from the adipocytes. So it oxidizes your fatty acids down. The products it gets from that often go into ketogenesis. Then you produce acetoacetate and ketone bodies, and they get distributed throughout the body and used in the tissues that they need to be. Now, different concentrations of things will inhibit glycolysis, but your muscles will start switching from glucose to fatty acids for fuel because glucose is scarce. You're going to direct it to the areas that need it most, mainly your brain. You no longer put pyruvate down into acetyl-CoA because you're producing acetyl-CoA from fatty acid metabolism, and your pyruvate, lactate, and alanine are exported to the liver for gluconeogenesis, so that's making glucose. So if we have a look at starvation, where different parts of the body switch from using glucose to different types of fuels such as ketone bodies. So after 3 days of starvation, the brain is consuming about 100 grams of glucose and 50 grams of ketone bodies within a 24-hour period. After 40 days of starvation, this is almost reversed. There's not much glucose left in your body by that stage. It's mainly ketone bodies. In terms of mobilization, your adipose tissue, after 3 days and 40 days is no difference. You're breaking down your fats because you're not getting any food. But your muscle to protein degradation, this is not a good thing. After 3 days, you start accessing your proteins to start breaking some down. But after 40 days, it has to slow, otherwise you'd waste away too quickly. But it's not a good sign when you're starting to use your muscles to have protein for energy. Fuel output of the liver. Gluconeogenesis is being carried out in the liver to produce glucose. At day 3, it's equivalent to the amount produced by ketone bodies. By day 40, you can't produce as much glucose via gluconeogenesis because you don't have as many precursors for gluconeogenesis. So there's a big shift, but the longer you starve, how it has an effect on your metabolism. So if we look at the priorities, so after 3 days of starvation, the liver forms large amounts of acetoacetate and D3-hydroxybutyrate, which are your ketone bodies, and the brain begins to consume a lot of acetoacetate in place of glucose. So if you look at the graph on the right, after a few days of starvation, the amount of ketone bodies you have accelerates immensely, so does your fatty acid breakdown. The amount of glucose in your plasma levels is dropping because you're not taking glucose anymore. The picture on the right would be similar to someone on an Atkins diet as well who's not taking carbohydrates, but they are getting enough fuel to sustain themselves. They're not starving themselves, they're just starving themselves of carbohydrates. Here we're talking about people who are starving themselves of all energy. Now, these things have psychological effects as well as physiological effects, and it's because we know that if you have high levels of ketones in the blood, it can start having an effect on the brain. Studies done have shown that, so this is back in the 40s, that people who were put on starvation-style diets develop hoarding and compulsive behaviours, social withdrawal. They can be self-harmful and self-neglectful. They can develop depression. They're not interested in sex. Compulsive habits. They lose their concentration easily. So whilst biochemically we can see what's happening, that you're no longer using glucose, you're switching to fat metabolism, and eventually you will use up your proteins from your organs and your muscles, and they will waste away until you get organ damage. That has an effect on your psyche as well. So in summary, here's just the pathways again in a different format. So we need glucose. If you're not taking glucose in, we need to make glucose for it to be redistributed. We're going to access fats from the fat cells, and any amino acid we can will start being directed into different pathways. Now, we need amino acids, as I mentioned before, to produce proteins that our genes transcribe and translate in our body. If you don't have any amino acids accessible because they're all being used for energy, the enzymes you need to function start to not being produced and your organs begin to fail. Starvation is bad. Thanks.